Hello everyone, this is Brett. Welcome back to my channel. Today I will continue in the discussion and reading of the book, The Seventh Vial by James Aiken Wiley. On page 158, Death of the Witnesses is the title of this chapter. And here we go. I'm going to start in right away. Thy way is in the sea, and thy path in the great waters, and thy footsteps are not known, unquote. Such was the exclamation of the psalmist as he recalled the past events which had befallen the church. And though how much of mystery her history had wrapped up in it, a retrospective divine providence at this day would furnish abundant cause to repeat the exclamation. One would have thought that after Christ had come and by his death put an end to the comparatively dark dispensation of Moses and introduced the more glorious and spiritual economy of the gospel, that after Christianity had been published to many of the nations and established in many of the countries of the Gentile world, it would never be in any danger of being suppressed. It might have been expected that a final end would be put to all the trials and calamities of the church, that her path henceforward would be one of unbroken prosperity and ever-enlarging triumph, that her light would wax brighter and brighter till at last it shone in the full splendor of the millennium, ushering in that day, long foretold and long adherently expected, which shall see all nations worshiping God and serving the Lamb. This is what the Old Testament saints doubtless expected. They looked forward to the coming of the Messiah as the end of the church's troubles and the introduction of an era in which the truth should have no opposition to encounter and its friends no suffering to endure in the way of its maintenance. This was that the primitive Christians also expected. This is what the primitive Christians also expected when the word of God grew mightily and prevailed. When the church, which had been confined hitherto to the land of Judea, went forth among the Gentiles, and the desolate parts of the earth were inhabited, little did they anticipate that her period of greatest darkness was yet to come, and that her severest trials were yet awaiting her, that all she had suffered in Egypt, all she had suffered in Babylon, was as nothing compared with those more dreadful sufferings which she had yet to endure at the hands of an enemy to arise within herself. And even we, when we look back and think of the little progress the gospel has made, and of the countries once enlightened, some plunged again into darkness, while others are Christian only in name. Even we say, wonder why God has allowed so great obstacles to impede the progress of the gospel, and not to impede it merely, but actually to roll it back and to leave those countries once covered with its fertilizing waters again bare, to be scorched by the fiery rays of idolatry. We feel persuaded that God has some special and great end in view in this arrangement. That the early triumph of the gospel would, in some way that we know not, have marred its ultimate and final triumph, and that the long delay of its success was some way or other connected with the happiness of future ages. We feel assured that God has some end of this kind in view in this arrangement, which shall be clearly understood by the men of future ages, and which we ourselves in other stages of our being shall know and admire. But meanwhile, it is a mystery unfathomable to us. It yields, however, no small satisfaction to know that all has happened according to the divine arrangement. We compare the events of the past 18 centuries with the prophecy before us. We find that there is an exact ordinance between the two. In the Apocalypse of John, in the Apocalypse, John was warned, and we, through him, that even after the truth should have been widely spread and the church planted in all the more important countries of the world, she should be brought into a more depressed condition than she had ever formerly been in, that the truth should be all but totally suppressed, that for 1260 years the whole world should apostatize, that the two witnesses only should appear in behalf of Christ, and that these should have to maintain a terrible warfare waged against them by the beast, the issue of which should be truly disastrous. We have already sketched the outline of the war with the witnesses. We have traced its beginning to the edicts of councils, and have shown that the form in which it was first displayed itself was that of the anathemas of popes, those thunders from the 7 hills, which have ever beckoned woe to the world. That scarcely had these anathemas been launched till hosts began to muster and immense armies to roll towards the Alps amid the deep valleys and inaccessible cliffs of which the witnesses dwelt. When it was seen that the sword was insufficient to exterminate them, the Inquisition was called into existence. To the fire and sword of war, the racks and wheels of the Holy Office were now added. Undismayed by the hosts that gathered round their hills, and bidding defiance to the terrors with which they were menaced, the witnesses still maintained their testimony. The world was in arms against them, but greater was he who was in them than he who was in the world. Their numbers were thinned. Their dwellings were laid in ashes. Their valleys were stained with the blood of their dear brethren or their beloved relatives. They were compelled to abandon the low plains and betake themselves to the high valleys, and there, amid rocks and eternal ice, though not altogether free of assaults from their enemies, and sometimes suffering dreadfully from their fury, yet defended in good degree by the difficult nature of their position. Quote, the place prepared of God, unquote. They maintained with noble consistency from age to age their testimony against the corruptions and idolatries of Rome. Throughout the whole of the 13th and 14th and 15th centuries was the war carried on. At last, it became apparent that the end approached, not because the fury and rage of the church's enemies had abated, but because her members had been well nigh all cut off. This happened toward the end of the 15th century. There is something so truly pathetic and mournful, something so much in the spirit of apocalyptic prediction itself. In Fleming's account of this transaction, that we shall give here, we shall here give at length. Okay, let's go back to the beginning of the sentence. I'm sorry. It's a big sentence too. Boy, oh boy. In the apocalypse, John was warned, and we through him, that even after the truth should have been widely spread and the church planted in all the more important countries of the world, she should be brought into a more depressed condition than she had ever formerly been in. That truth should be all but totally suppressed. That for 1260 years the whole world should apostatize. That two witnesses should only appear, that two witnesses only should appear in behalf of Christ, and that these should have to maintain a terrible warfare waged against them by the beast, the issue of which should be truly disastrous. We have already sketched the outline of the war with the witnesses. We have traced its beginning to the edicts of councils, and have shown that the form in which it was first displayed itself was that of the anathemas of popes, those thunders from the 7 hills which have ever beckoned woe to the world. That scarcely had these anathemas been launched till hosts began to muster and immense armies to roll towards the Alps amid the deep valleys and inaccessible cliffs of which the witnesses dwelt. When it was seen that the sword was insufficient to exterminate them, the Inquisition was called into existence. To the fire and the sword of war, the racks and the wheels of the Holy Office were now added. Undismayed by the hosts that gathered round their hills, and bidding defiance to the terrors which they were menaced, the witnesses still maintained their testimony. The world was in arms against them, but greater was he. Oh, I already read this. Shame on me. Yeah, greater was he who was in them than he who was in the world. Their numbers were thin, their dwellings were laid in ashes, their valleys were stained with blood of their dear brethren or their beloved relatives. They were compelled to abandon the low plains and betake themselves to the high valleys, and there, amid rocks of eternal ice, though not altogether free of assaults from their enemies, and sometimes suffering dreadfully from their fury, yet defended in good degree by the difficult nature of their position. Quote, the place prepared of God, unquote. They maintained with noble consistency, from age to age, their testimony against the corruptions and idolatries of Rome. Throughout the whole of the 13th and 14th and 15th centuries was the war carried on. At last it became apparent that the end approached, not because the fury and rage of the church's enemies had abated, but because her members had been well nigh all cut off. This happened towards the end of the 15th century. There is something so truly pathetic and mournful, something so much in the spirit of apocalyptic prediction itself. In the north, a third to Thrace, Bulgaria, and neighboring places, and fourth to Asia, Palestine, and Egypt. They did all indeed safely return to their brethren, but with this sorrowful news, that they found no church of Christ that was pure or free from the grossest errors, superstition, and idolatry. This was in the year 1497. And when they sent two of their number 2 years afterwards, via Luke, Prague, and Thomas German, to go into Italy, France, and other places to see if there were any old Waldenses left alive, they returned with the same melancholy news as the former had done, that they could neither find nor hear of any remaining. Only they were informed of the martyrdom of Savonarola, who suffered in the year 1498. And they were told of some of the few remains of the Piedmontese, that they were scattered and hid among the Alps, but nobody knew where. Now, a few years after this, even a few remains of the Taborites were found out and persecuted, hardly any escaping, so that in 1510, 6 suffered together publicly, and the year following, I'm going to assume that AC, I stumbled there, I didn't read that because I was thinking, well, what is that? After Christ, AC? So BC before Christ, AC after Christ? I'm not sure. But in 510, 6 suffered publicly, and the year following, that famous martyr, Andreas Palawica, who I think was the last of that period, from whose death in the end of the year 1511 or beginning of 1512 to the dawning of the Reformation by the first preaching of Carolus Lastius and Zuingalius, who appeared at last a year before Luther, as Hottinger and others tell us. Okay, now these are names I am very unfamiliar with. Forgive me for butchering their pronunciation. I don't know these names at all. But, okay, so the dawning of the Reformation by the first preaching of these two names, who appeared at the last year before Luther, as Hottinger and others tell us. There was only about 3 years and a half, which answers as near as can be to the 3 days and a half of that unburied state of the witnesses. So that Spirit's entering into the witnesses, verse 11, began with the year 1516, if not the year before, though This appeared most remarkably when Luther opposed the Pope publicly in 1517, unquote. The two witnesses were not individuals, but organized societies, churches. Their death, therefore, must needs be symbolic, not their death as individuals, but their apparent extermination as organized societies, the suppression of that public testimony which these churches had borne before Christendom. Now, if we look back, we discover but one period in the history of Christendom to which the prediction can apply. The period we have indicated, the beginning of the 16th century, just before the Reformation. During that period, all public testimony of the witnesses against the papacy was silenced in every part of Europe, and Rome appeared to be universally and completely triumphant. Fleming has told us in his own affecting language with what wonder and dismay the few individuals who were left after the slaughters and massacres of 3 centuries beheld the universal triumph of the beast, witnessed the total extinction of the gospel light, which had ceased to be held forth by any constituted church. He has told us that, if only half believing the tremendous fact of which they were the witnesses, they sent out 4 messengers to search throughout the earth, if happily they might discover somewhere a pure church of Christ. The messengers returned, like the dove to Noah, but with no olive leaf plucked off. They returned to tell those who had sent them forth that the faith of the apostles existed nowhere, that error and superstition everywhere prevailed, that a second deluge had rolled over the world. And don't forget now, the deluge is when the world was destroyed by flood, okay? A second deluge had rolled over the world, and that its dark waters stood above the tops of the highest hills. But the most satisfactory and convincing exposition of the fulfillment of this apocalyptic prediction is that which Mr. Eliot has given. By a variety of historical references and documents, he has shown that from the 5th of May, 1514 to the 31st of October, 1817, 3 years and a half precisely, all public testimony against the papacy was suppressed, and that at a later date, that testimony was suddenly and gloriously revived. The importance and interest of the subject will justify us in giving a series of extracts from that part of the Jorge Apocalypticae to show the eminent clearness of Mr. Eliot's demonstration. Quote unquote, and thus, says Mr. Eliot, quote, what was the aspect of things when the new 16th century opened? Let Milner be my first historic testimony. The 16th century opened, he says, with a prospect of all others the most gloomy in the eyes of every true Christian. Corruption, both in doctrine and in practice, had exceeded all bounds, and the general face of Europe, through Christ's name, was everywhere professed, presented nothing that was properly evangelical. The Roman pontiffs were the uncontrolled patrons of impiety. The Waldenses were too feeble and to molest the popedom, and the Hussites, divided among themselves, had worn out by a long series of contentions, were at length reduced to silence. To the same purport is the testimony of Mosheim. At the commencement of this century, no danger seemed to threaten the Roman pontiffs. The agitations previously excited by the Waldenses, Albigenses, Beccards, and more recently by the Bohemians have been suppressed by the council and the sword. And the wretched surviving remnant of Bohemian heretics were an object rather of contempt than fear. So again, Mr. Cunningham, whose historic sketch of the epoch I may the rather quote because of his prophetic explanation is independent of it. At the commencement of the 16th century, Europe reposed in the deep sleep of spiritual death under the iron yoke of the papacy. That haughty power, like the Assyrian of the prophet said, in the plenitude of his insolence, my hand hath found as a nest the riches of the people, and as one gathereth eggs, I have gathered all the earth, and there was none that moved the wing, or opened the mouth, or peeped. Once more, in language strikingly to the point, the writer of the article on the Reformation in the Encyclopedia Britannica thus describes the era: everything was quiet, every heretic exterminated, and the whole Christian world supinely acquiesced in the enormous absurdities inculcated by the Romish Church, when I only break off the quotation at his notice of just such a speedy, sudden, and extraordinary revival of the witnessing as we saw from the prophetic sequel ought to follow the event intended by the death of the witnesses, unquote. Having adverted to the proofs arising from the apocalyptic description of the scene of the slaughter, quote, the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also the Lord was crucified, unquote, and of the public rejoicings on the account of their death held by them of the peoples and all and kindreds and tongues and nations, to which we ourselves shall afterwards have occasion to refer. Mr. Eliot proceeds as follows. In turning from prophecy to history, from the symbolic picture to the things symbolized, it seems almost impossible to mistake the precise scene and occasion alluded to. It can surely be none other than that of the very Lateran Council, held from 1512 to 1517, under the pontificates of Julius II and Leo X, just before the Reformation, having stated that the object for which this council was assembled was the suppression of all that might yet remain in Western Christendom of witnesses for Christ, and particularly the Bohemian Hussites. For both the Lollards of England and the Waldenses of Piedmont had been reduced to silence. Mr. Eliot resumes in a papal bull issued with appropriation of the council in the very next or 8th session held December 1513, a charge was issued summoning the dissidents in question, the Bohemian witnesses, without fail to appear and plead before the council at the next session, unless, indeed, they should have previously done so before a neighboring papal legate. The object declared being their conviction and reduction within the bosom of the Catholic Church, and the time finally fixed for the said important